My name is Lee Silver, and I am a professor of molecular biology and public policy at Princeton University. The idea of biotechnology has overlaps with other scientific pursuits, but has a very specific difference in that biotechnology is the control or manipulation of living things. And our feelings that we have, or that some people have, about living things and whether or not we should be disturbing them causes a lot of reaction against various kinds of biotechnology. And it's the kind of reaction that you get that you don't have in the field of electronics or any of the other sciences. So it comes down to the fact that biotechnologists, as a whole, I would say, have a technology or groups of technologies that take advantage of living things, that control the output of living things, or that manipulate their genes in some way. There are two main issues that are specific to biotechnology, to different fields of biotechnology, and they have to do with how we treat, or whether we are experimenting or manipulating human beings, and then that comes to a question of, is that ethical? We have a set of ethics as a society in how we deal with human beings. And the big issue there is not whether human beings have rights and that we shouldn't be hurting human beings or experimenting on human beings without their permission. The big question there is, what is a human being? And that's where the dispute is. Is a single cell embryo a human being, in which case it deserves protection, or is it just a single cell? So there's the dispute that occurs there. Certainly when the embryo develops into a fetus, it becomes more complicated as the fetus develops into a baby. Now, the second issue of biotechnology that's right to cause concern is, are we manipulating food products, for example, or manipulating organisms that will then go and harm the environment in some way? And so, yes, I think that there has to be a regulatory process that is in place to make sure that the science supports the idea that the biotechnology that you're implementing is not going to be harmful to the environment, harmful to you and food. So yes, of course, regulation has to be considered there. I think it's very important not to use scary words that elicit fright in people for reasons that they may not understand. And the word eugenics, which means good genes, or generating children with good genes, the word eugenics has a horrible connotation because of how it was implemented in the beginning of the 20th century in the United States, in other countries, and then, of course, in Nazi Germany. And the way they imagined eugenics was they were going to tell some people to reproduce, and they, meaning the government representing society, said, you can reproduce, you can't reproduce. You can come into America, you can't come into America because your genes make you unfit. And that kind of eugenics has two huge problems. First of all, it violates human rights by telling some people that they can reproduce and others that they can't, and that's a violation of human rights. And second, the so-called science it was based on was totally faulty. And so for both of those reasons, that eugenics has been totally discredited. And of course, it ended up with the Nazis killing off large groups of people. Now, what is happening now, I would say, is that no scientist believes in either of those aspects of eugenics. No geneticist believes in that. What we're talking about now is not having the government tell people who can reproduce and who can't. The question is whether parents themselves should be allowed to choose what genes go into their own children. And there are a couple of reasons why that's so totally different. And one of the things is that there's no government that's intervening. The second thing is that parents, all normal parents, want to help their children, not hurt their children. There are a tiny number of ambiguous genetic changes that some people might want to do, but the vast majority of parents, if they could, want their children to prosper. And so any kind of genetic changes they could imagine, or I could imagine, that they would want are ones that help their children prosper. I originally speculated that that rich people would have the money to use this technology, and it's interesting because if child is given a certain genetic constitution by the parent, the difference between genetics and environmental advantages is that the child could then transmit that same gene to his or her children along with other enhancements. And so the idea was that you could get an evolutionary process, not by natural selection, but by the fact that in the beginning there were classes based on different economic means, and the class with more money could advance in this way. I don't think, I have disavowed that belief for Western society now, mainly because the technology has become so cheap that in Western society it's not going to be the top 10%, it'll be the whole country. And in fact, there will be genetic vaccinations, I suspect, someday, where the government will offer to couples and say, we're going to do a genetic enhancement so that your child doesn't get cancer and that your child doesn't get these genetic influence diseases. So it could be something like that. I wouldn't want the government to tell people they had to do it, but it is interesting that it would benefit society. So where's the split? And the split would only occur if you had two groups of people who never came into contact with each other. Because once you have contact, you have gene flow, and that destroys the split. That won't happen in Western society. That won't happen in America, Europe, Japan, and now the upcoming China and Southeast Asia, because there is what a geneticist would call gene flow. And the gene flow is so significant, it's going to stop that from happening. I worry about the poorest countries in the world, and if they're not brought in as members of the global family, there could be something. But it's pure speculation, and it was meant to get people to think, not to say that it was definitely going to happen. The Bush administration had a very extreme view on bioethics. Essentially, they were taking the line of people who claimed that single-cell embryos, which are invisible to the eye, should have the same rights as you or me. And that's an extreme view. It's not a view that most Americans hold. And scientists were arguing that they could take these single cells, embryos at this very early stage, when the embryo, you can create this embryo in a petri dish. These embryos are created in petri dishes to help women overcome infertility when the embryos are put back into the woman. But if you just work with these cells in a petri dish, the cells can't form a fetus. They can't form anything resembling a fetus or a human being. All they can do is grow into a bunch. And so there's a very nice line, which is that scientists can work with cells in a petri dish, and you say to them, okay, you can work with these cells. They're not human beings. We're going to work with them in a petri dish for research purposes to try to find cures for diseases. And that's what scientists would like. That's what many leaders of the Democratic Party would like. Sure, there's a line, you don't go across it, but it's nice. It's a nice line as far as science goes, because what you create in a petri dish is not a person. It can't be a person. The Obama administration has advisors like Harold Varmus and Eric Lander. Those are his two top science advisors. Those are leaders of the field of biotechnology. And the view I just gave you is the view that they hold. So they have the influence in the administration now. And I think they'll get the administration to slowly go in a direction which will support research in this way. The real world impact that Obama is having should be looked at in contrast to the real world impact that Bush had. During the Bush administration, it wasn't that human embryo research was illegal. Human embryo research was not illegal, generally speaking. If you used private money, you couldn't use government funds for the research except in a very extremely limited way. And that set up an environment, an investment environment, and an environment of how people thought about what science was acceptable or not acceptable, in which the top scientists in the world, some of them just went to other countries. Singapore had a great influx of American scientists, and China is getting all the Chinese expatriates back. And California decided it was going to be the state that funded embryo research. And I had a student who studied this and found that the flow of young people to California was enormous. And so students would get their PhDs, and then they would go to California. Now, it's interesting what Obama has done already is change the environment. People understand that they're not going to be religious fanatics breaking down the doors anymore. We don't have that environment. And it's slowly getting to the point where research will be completely acceptable on cells in a petri dish. But the environment's already changed. The losers are Singapore and California. So, because California no longer has this unique position, scientists realize, well, they can go other places and be confident that their research won't be outlawed. The word cloning or term human cloning is a very unfortunate term in that it means something totally different to scientists than it means in general speak, in the way the public understands the word. And this is actually one of many examples of words that have specific scientific meanings, and those scientific meanings get distorted when those words go out into the public sphere. Cloning is one of those words. Cloning is a word, unlike most scientific words, which was defined actually by a scientist in a publication to mean a very specific thing. And it was used in the context of botany, and it was the idea that you could take a cutting from a plant, clone means twig, and you could grow that plant, the second one, you could grow it, cutting from that, and that was cloning because you were getting a series of plants which were genetically identical to each other, and they wanted to have a word that explained that. So plants were not being produced sexually. That word then became part of the lexicon of molecular biologists about bacteria clone all the time. I give you a clone, you give me a clone. That's the way lab people talk. And then it burst into the public limelight with Dolly, cloned sheep. People now do not understand that the scientific meaning of the word does not mean identical organisms. And people don't understand that there actually are already millions, if not tens of millions, of human clones walking among us and talking to us. And we don't call them clones, we call them identical twins. But identical twins are clones, according to the scientific definition of the term. So when people are fearful of human cloning, that's not what they're thinking about. They're thinking about stealing somebody's soul or replicating a person in their wholeness. And that is actually impossible according to the laws of physics as we understand them. It's very interesting to ask what the goal of a bioethics panel is, because it's not clear what a bioethics panel should do. A bioethics panel could serve to give advice to the president or to Congress, or it could serve as a means for educating the public. And the two bioethics panels that have had any weight, the one that President Clinton formed and the one that President Bush formed, they were formed for different purposes. I would like the Obama Bioethics Commission to be more like the Clinton Commission. And the Clinton Commission was chaired by Princeton University President Harold Shapiro. He was an economist. Clinton brought him in because he didn't know any bioethics or biotechnology. He put together a committee of well-known voices. He had legal scholars, and he had public policy people and economists, and he had some representatives from religion. And the point there really was to educate. That was the point of the committee, was to educate rather than suggest laws. The Bush Commission, their point was to push a particular viewpoint on people. And it was stacked with people who believed that a single cell embryo is a human being. And the whole point of that commission, it was run by Leon Kass, and it had other people like Robert George, who's my colleague. The whole point of that commission was to convince the American public that this was unethical. The Obama Commission, I hope, will be more like the Clinton Commission, to bring in people from different fields to have a scholarly discussion, not to stop debate, but to have a discussion which brings light onto the topic, and also light onto where the disagreements are. Nobody disagrees that human beings deserve human rights. The disagreement in terms of human embryo research or stem cell research comes down to, is the cell a human being or not? And that's a religious question. And we have to get the public to understand that's the disagreement. It's a very specific question that's religious in basis. I'm not convinced it will happen faster with the Obama administration, because when it comes to animal biotechnology, the greatest or the largest group of opponents probably voted overwhelmingly for Obama. The opponents of animal biotechnology are not people who are traditionally religious. The opponents are people who actually claim not to be religious, but they have what I would call this notion of nature is good, natural is best, we shouldn't tamper with Mother Nature. I think that's the strongest group of opponents to this technology. The concept of environmentalism is something that I would hold to, as long as it's defined in a way that we protect the environment from harm. We don't emit poisons into the air or into the water, and we make sure to maintain large areas of wilderness. So I think that a lot of what environmentalists should want is large areas of wilderness that are protected, and they provide all sorts of benefits to humankind. What has happened now, though, is there are groups of environmentalists who have made up problems that don't exist. And I say they've made them up because the speculation turns into into a fact, just sort of from when it goes from person to person. These are people who think that genetically modified foods are bad for the environment, when in many cases there are examples of genetically modified foods which would be better for the environment, not in every way, no matter how you define the environment. And so that's where the conflict comes, is that if you start out with an ideological point of view, genetic modification is bad. That is a religion because you can't move past that view. I would prefer to say it doesn't matter how we get to point B. Point A doesn't matter. What matters is point B. If we can use genetic modification to get something that is good for humanity, grow more food, good for the environment, then that's what we should be aiming for. We shouldn't be aiming for it's the process that matters. There's this very interesting belief, and it's very widespread. It's not just among environmental or organic food activists. And there's this widespread notion that natural things should be given a presumption of healthiness, that if it's natural, the presumption is it's good and healthy, and that if it's synthetic, the presumption is it's bad and unhealthy. Now, that belief is actually false, and we know that empirically. We know empirically that foods or crops or plants in general produce the most poisonous things that we've ever come in contact with. They produce anthrax and strychnine and all these other kinds of poison. There are thousands and thousands of poisonous chemicals that plants produce, and they've evolved to produce these chemicals to protect themselves. So, so we can't say, oh, it's natural, therefore it must be healthy. We all know that you go into the forest and there are mushrooms you eat and you'll drop dead. Now, what about the idea that synthetic is unhealthy? And again, it doesn't matter where a chemical is synthesized. Cells synthesize chemicals, and you can synthesize chemicals in labs, or you can genetically engineer a cell to synthesize the chemical that you want, and that's being done right now to try to produce this anti-malarial agent in simple cells. Again, it comes to the question of what matters, the process or the product. If you can't distinguish a product made in two different ways, then I would argue there is no reason to prefer one way over the other, just at the outset. So genetically modified foods have to go through a very, very rigorous approval process in the United States, I think over rigorous. And there are very, very few of them actually that have made it through the process. And the one gene that has been put into a lot of different foods is called Bt. It's the name of a bacteria that produces a protein. So plants with the gene make this protein, and this protein is gobbled up by the larvae, the worms that eat the plant, like corn leaves. And then the protein goes inside the larvae, and it paralyzes their gut. So it kills those larvae. Activists have been very much against the use of this technology to kill larvae and to get higher yields of crops. However, that technology emerged from the organic food industry because this bacteria, which is a bacteria that grows in the soil, Bt, is part of a natural organic way to put pesticides onto plants. They don't call them pesticides, they call them botanicals. It's natural. And so organic farmers, lots of organic farmers spray their plants with the whole bacteria, and that's okay. It does exactly the same thing. That's accepted for organic food. But if you put a gene in that makes this one protein, you're not putting the whole bacteria in, that's unacceptable. If you look at how much BT is actually present on the genetically modified plant versus the organic plant, there's more BT on the organic plant. So that immediately destroys the argument. But none of it matters because BT is a protein that if you understand the molecular biology, you understand the protein only works because it's a lock and key binding mechanism inside the insect's gut. The protein does nothing to us. The protein has been fed to mice. There's no reason to expect the protein to cause allergies or anything else, and it doesn't. Everybody in America has eaten it, and nobody's gotten a stomachache. The Western religious tradition produces both the reaction against biotechnology, which they're associated with, and we know they're associated with, and in addition, it produces a next generation of what I would call a post-Christian opposition to biotechnology among those who grew up with Western religion and have rejected it. So if you think about Western religion, and Western religion is most codified in a Catholic, in the Catholic area. The Western religion, Catholics, other Christians of the same thought, have no problem with biotechnology when it is applied to animals and plants. So they're fine, they'll say just let's regulate it properly and let's consider it in terms of whether it's economically good or bad and how it affects the environment. That's fine. Their sole area of concern is biotechnology's use on human beings, and human beings includes the class to them of single-cell embryos. So all of that opposition comes down to single-cell embryos. They question the use of drugs that can affect the way people think. Drugs like Ritalin, for example, drugs that increase your memory or decrease. They're worried about that. But the most important worry is at the embryo stage, where they think scientists are killing human beings. It's very clear. What has happened, especially in Europe, where genetically modified foods are absolutely forbidden, if not in law, by the culture. There's a huge war going on between Europe and the United States in terms of whether Europe will allow the importation of genetically modified foods. And what you find in Europe is most people have given up traditional religion. So you have this whole continent that was Catholic, and young people have come up since World War II, have thrown off the church, especially in France, and my speculation now, this is not a fact, my speculation is they've thrown off the church, and the church had this God in the sky, over a single God, not many gods, God in the sky, God knows the future, God is trying to get you to go along the right path, don't mess with God. Now, if you throw away that, there might be an emptiness in your stomach. You might need some other spiritual idea to replace the God of the Bible. And the idea that is filled in so easily is the Mother Nature goddess, Gaia. So people now say, okay, Mother Nature is one God, that comes from Western tradition, and we shouldn't mess with Mother Nature. We shouldn't be tampering, and all the crops are part of Mother Nature, and it all sits in this balance, and if we tamper with it, the whole thing will collapse, and that's bad. That's an ideology, that's a religion. It's not a religion that has a name, but I think that's where the opposition to biotechnology in the non-human sphere comes from. I would say that transhumanism, if it's a religion, it has no relationship to the real world right now. The religion is based on speculating that human beings can become post-human beings. And I find it to be a very strange group of people because I don't think, I who talk about this a lot, don't think this is going to happen, that people are going to evolve during my lifetime. And it doesn't matter what I say, 100 years from now, people are going to be talking and they'll have their own decisions to make. And so I'm not sure what transhumanists want. I think, to me, it's more of a science fiction cult than anything else. Now, how does that differ from the Mother Nature cult? The difference is that transhumanists can be ignored and it has no effect on the world, whereas the Mother Nature cult does have an effect on the world. They have a huge effect. They have prevented Europe from bringing in genetically modified foods that would help Europeans eat for less money. Now, the Europeans are rich, so they can spend more money for their food and still be satisfied. But then the Europeans will go to sub-Saharan Africa and tell the sub-Saharan Africans not to allow the United States to send grain, even though their people are starving in sub-Saharan Africa. You don't want to take American grain because American grain is genetically modified. And so, in my mind, anybody who says that is religious because essentially they are sacrificing individual human beings for the good of some greater ideology. The difference between Eastern and Western religions is far, far greater than the difference between Christianity and Judaism and Islam. Those three religions all come out of the same background, Bible book, if you will, even though people in those areas are at each other's throats. In the East, there are many different religions, and what you can say about them is that, unlike the West, they don't have a single God who's in charge. Either they have many gods, or they have no gods. And so it's never one, it's zero or many. And so there isn't a single god to please. The gods are actually fighting with each other in the Hindu religion. So that's the first point. And the second point is they have a notion of life based on karma, or they believe there is no soul. I mean, so it's one extreme or the other. And karma basically means that you come back, you're reincarnated based on what you do yourself. You're not listening to anybody else. You just follow what is right for you, and you don't have to obey these bigger rules. And also, there isn't this future Jerusalem in the sky, which is where Western religions come from. You better follow the rules, and that's going to get you to the future Jerusalem. And I think that also affects the post-Christians, all the non-religious people. They also think you don't follow the rules, the world's going to give up on us. It just doesn't happen in the East. In the East, there are different gods. In the East, they're not worried about this. There is no defined future. The future is made by them. So they don't have the same hang-ups that people in the West have, and they're willing to, since they don't have those hang-ups, they don't have the same fears if they're educated. And I've spent a lot of time talking to people in Southeast Asia and Asia. If anything, they're too lax in their regulations. But they just, in general, don't have the same hang-up. They're willing to manipulate food for their sustenance, for the betterment of themselves and their society. I wrote my book, Remaking Eden, in 1996, and I speculated about what technologies might be coming down the road. And my speculations actually brought a lot of negative comments from other scientists who said, you can't speculate, and that's all hyperbole, and we're never going to be able to do the things that you claim. One of the things that I claimed was, in 1996, I claimed that we would have a complete sequence of the human genome by 2020. Now, it turns out that we had that in 2003, and I think that's a proper way of looking at the entire field of biotechnology. It has gone forward so much faster than anybody could have possibly imagined, both in the sense that we understand it a lot quicker, and we have the tools to manipulate living things, and we have the computer technology that's essential to read and to write DNA, to read and write all the different things that are going on inside cells. So biotechnology is really limitless. So what do you want to do with it? So if you can imagine something, it's probably going to be done. If it doesn't break the laws of physics, if you can actually write on a piece of paper something, then we can do it. So let me tell you the grand plan of Craig Venter. The bad boy of biotech is what he's called, because he's an entrepreneur, and he challenged the government to sequence the human genome in 3 years for a tenth of the money the government was using, and it was a tie in the end. But he made a lot of money, and he wants to help the world, and I actually agree with his vision. Okay, and this is the vision. What do we want as a people? We want to have renewable fuel, and so we want to be able to use energy that doesn't affect the environment, that doesn't affect the atmosphere in any way. We want to maintain wilderness so that we can maintain biodiversity, and that's for aesthetic reasons. It's not for utilitarian. It's that we have a love of nature. Let's keep nature. Okay, that's the second thing. We want to do this in an environmental friendly way, in a way that's economic, in a way that's sustainable. So what Craig Venter would like to do, ultimately, is create organisms which look like trees. In fact, they are trees. But instead of these organisms producing sap, the organisms would produce something like diesel fuel or some other kind of source of energy. And so you'd have a tree, it's taking in the sunlight, and sunlight's being converted directly into fuel. And I mean, diesel fuel is an old-fashioned way of thinking, but that's what plants do, is they convert sunlight into molecules that hold energy. It's where all our fossil fuels come from. And then you have a system, and this is science fiction right now, but you have a system whereby you have a whole forest, and under the ground, the fuel sap is being collected into pipes and coming out, and so the forest provides comfort to us. The fuel is completely carbon neutral. It's taking carbon out of the air, you put carbon back into the air, and you then take the fuel, if it's diesel fuel, and you don't let cars run on it. You put that into energy generating stations, which create hydrogen fuel or some clean fuel. And so all of this is dependent on biotechnology. It's dependent on saying we have manipulated the earth, and we've been doing this for 10,000 years. This is not something that started in the 20th century. If we look at the European landscape, there's nothing in Europe that's natural. And there's nothing that's been natural in Europe for hundreds of years. If you go across France, you see these pleasant meadows and fields of grain and cows and a few clumps of trees here and there. None of that's natural. The natural European landscape was covered in evergreen forests. They were all cut down to have agriculture. And what's growing there now is not natural. And so the notion that that's natural, it's false. You might like it, it might be pretty, but it's not natural, it's human created. And so if humans have done that, and humans have done worse things to the world, my feeling is, why not take over? Why not say, okay, we've manipulated the plants, let's put together systems that will sustain human life, provide food, let's use biotechnology to the greatest extent possible. Let's make sure that we don't do things that harm people. That's easier than it sounds. And I think that would be an ideal world. Carl Sagan, the great popularizer of astronomy, was never elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and many people think that is because the other astrophysicists and astronomers didn't like the fact that he was popularizing their field, and they thought that he shouldn't do this, that he was cheapening the field. This attitude is expanded in many ways in biotechnology. It's even much worse than what Carl Sagan had to deal with. And the reason is that in graduate school, we are told kind of, never explicitly, but it's implicit, that first of all, if you're in biomedical sciences, never speculate about the future or about where your research result might go in the future, because you don't want to give people false hopes. And unlike astronomy, biomedical science is geared very often to curing diseases. And so you have a breakthrough, it's possible that it might affect diabetes in the future. You know, because you've watched your thesis advisor and other professors, you know that you say, okay, we have made this advance, but this is far from, a cure for diabetes. Cure for diabetes may never happen, so don't think that we're ever going to get there. And the idea, and it's really a subconscious idea, is don't give false hope to people. Okay, so that's one thing. So don't speculate, don't give false hope. The second thing is don't scare people. Biotechnology is a really powerful technology, and if you scare people with the kinds of things it could do, then they're going to shut us down. We are doing great research, and we're doing things that are going to help humanity, and because of you speculating, you're scaring people, and they'll reject the whole thing. You tell people about human cloning, you just bring it up, and they want to shut down our research on cells. So don't talk about that. So those are very strong kinds of feelings that other people have. And I've gotten emails from many people, many scientists over the years, condemning me for doing both of those things, speculating about the future and also talking about biotechnology in a very broad sense. It could be used for this purpose or that purpose. The third thing is that in a field like biology, it's very difficult to bring it to a lay understanding without simplification. And so you have to simplify if you want people to understand it. And I think that it requires a scientist who has a much deeper knowledge to do the simplification, because you know what you can simplify and what you can't. And that's what I try to do. But it means that I'm not 100% accurate. If I say that every cell in my body has the same DNA, I'll get attacked for saying, no, there are cells in the immune system where the DNA is a little bit different. And my response will be, well, if we get into all the details, you lose the big picture. So there are a lot of scientists who say, you're not being accurate, you're misleading people. They're very narrow. And then the final problem is that some people are jealous. This guy's on TV. How does he have the right to be on TV? And I'm not even talking just about my own work. I'm talking about other people's work. How dare I do that? The other people should be presenting their work, but the other people can't. Different people have an ability or not to be able to present things at a lay level. So I think that sort of summarizes what's going on.